Hello, everyone. It gives me great pleasure that so many of you can join with us this afternoon at our seminar entitled Tackling Educational Disadvantage in the Early Years Towards a Fair Start for All. My name is Dr. Glenda Walsh, and I'm Head of Early Years Education at Stranmillis and Assistant Director for our Centre of Research in Educational Underachievement. And I will be chairing the event this afternoon. Can I just emphasize that throughout the presentations that you switch off your camera and go on to mute to avoid any technical issues? And also, can I ask that you make use of the comment box? I see some have already started to do so, but throughout the presentations to add comments and add questions. And we will return to these during the question and answer session after all presentations have been completed. Without further ado, I will now pass over to our Director for Research and Scholarship and Director of our Centre for Research and Educational Underachievement, Dr. Noel Purdy, to open this afternoon's event. Over to you, Noel.
Thanks very much, Glenda, and good afternoon, everybody. And as Glenda said, a very warm welcome to this, our latest CREU webinar. And I say CREU, not all of you may be familiar with that term. CREU is our Centre for Research in Educational Underachievement here at Stranmillis University College in Belfast. CREU was established in 2018, and since then it has gone on to engage in a wide variety of research, close to practice research really, focused on aspects of educational disadvantage, educational inequality and underachievement. We've engaged in lots of studies around homeschooling during COVID-19, special educational needs, social mobility. We looked at the support available to Syrian refugees in Northern Ireland. And of course, we have a major focus on early years, thanks to Glenda and her colleagues. I'm Director of Research and Scholarship at Stranmillis, but I'm also the Director of CREU. And last year, I was very privileged to chair the expert panel on educational underachievement here in Northern Ireland, whose final report and action plan, A Fair Start, was launched on the 1st of June 2021. A major focus of our work last year and a major focus of A Fair Start is early years. Indeed, 13 of the 47 actions that we proposed relate to early years, and it was our first key area. That shows the commitment that we had as an expert panel to addressing educational underachievement and to addressing that as early as possible with our youngest and most vulnerable children. So today's theme is particularly timely, tackling educational disadvantage in the early years towards a fair start for all. And I'm really delighted that so many of you from all over Ireland, north and south, from all over the UK, and indeed further afield, have been able to join us today. We've got a very distinguished field of experts, our distinguished keynote speaker, Professor Lynn, but also our panelists, Dr. Helen Lewis, Dr. Lara Bronson, Dr. Leah O'Toole, Dr. Barbara McConnell, and Dr. Liz Chesworth. And I'm sure Glenda will say more about each of those guests as we go through today. So you're all most welcome, but I'm sure like me, you're looking forward to getting started. So it's my pleasure to hand over back to your host this afternoon. That's my colleague, Dr. Glenda Walsh, who's Head of Early Years, but also Deputy Director of CREU, to take you forward into this afternoon. I hope you enjoy the session. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, we're now going to turn to our main event for this afternoon, our keynote address by Professor Lynn. And I'm no doubt that you're in for a treat. Professor Lynn is Pro-Director and Vice Dean of Research at the Institute of Education, and she is also Professor of Early Childhood Education. Lynn's expertise is early learning, early childhood education, and international evidence-based research, particularly in developing country contexts. She has led and co-led many research grants, including the first systematic review of early childhood development and peacebuilding policies across 14 conflict-affected countries, funded by the United Nations and UNICEF. Lynn was also co-principal investigator of an international study to review the impact of the World Bank $23 million Early Learning Partnership Program, and principal investigator of the Education Endowment Foundation funded project Manor Park Talks an evidence-based intervention programme of professional development to improve the outcomes for disadvantaged 2-year-olds in Newham, UK. Lynn's most recent project includes acting as co-investigator for a UK-funded interdisciplinary research hub, Action Against Stunting, 19.76 million, which aims to tackle the complex global challenge of child stunting in India, Indonesia, and Senegal. So as you can hear, Lynn has outstanding experience in the field of tackling educational disadvantage in the early years. And we're really excited to hear what you have to tell us, Lynn. You're extremely welcome to Belfast this afternoon, so over to you.
Thank you very much, Glenda. And thank you very much to the committee and to everyone in Stranmillis for inviting me to be with you today at the conference. It's a great honor and privilege for me to be here. I just want to start by saying I wish I was there in person and we were all able to have the opportunity to meet in person and to enjoy the wonderful sights of Belfast and Stranmillis. You know, it's just unfortunate that we are having to contend with the disruptions of the last couple of years, but hopefully not too long more. And I'm sure, like me, we are all just thankful of how far we've come. And I think I'm just always amazed about the wonders of technology and how it has enabled all of us to be here together virtually. So the theme of the conference today, I think, is absolutely topical and important, tackling disadvantage, educational disadvantage in the early years. And it's really timely and fitting. And I think particularly given the challenges that we've been through in the last couple of years, you know, I think the pandemic has certainly exposed some of the very deep-seated social inequalities and economic divides that we know as a society, not only in education, but also in many other areas of society that we know of, you know, such as health, social welfare, social protection, with children and families, and so on. So I thought it would be fitting for my lecture today to share with you some of my reflections of some of the questions that I think we are currently facing in the early childhood field. And I wanted to start with a landscape of some of the educational inequalities in the global context. So just to give you a kind of a structure of what I hope to be sharing with you this afternoon. Graham, the next slide, please. Thank you. I will like to start by thinking about the global context, the challenges and paradoxes in tackling some of the educational disadvantage. In particular, looking through the lens of what I call an impact and outcomes agenda. And then I'll say a bit about the World Bank Early Learning Partnership Program that I've worked on a couple of years ago, and which Glenda mentioned in her kind introduction, and then to share with you some of my final reflections. So I hope, you know, this will be an interesting suite of areas that we could think about together this afternoon. So to start with, I think we have, well, I want to start on a positive note, and I think we have much to celebrate about, in the sense that I think we have come a long way as a field. And over the last decade, certainly, in the last 10 years, early childhood care and education have become a national priority in many countries, in the UK certainly. And the United Nations Global Sustainable Development Agenda, ensuring more equitable and inclusive early childhood education, is very much now a central theme. The next slide, thank you. So that, you know, this encapsulates, I think, exactly where we are as a field. You know, I think about my own journey as an early childhood educator and advocate, if you like. You know, 20 years ago, we are still having to justify and make a case for the importance of the early years, but now it is absolutely up there as part of a global development agenda. However, I think it's also indisputable that the deep-seated inequalities that I mentioned earlier at the start is still very much present. We haven't solved that intractable challenge of addressing inequality. So I think it's also indisputable, particularly with the emergence of the pandemic in the last 2 years, you know, the way it has changed our world exponentially and has really forced us to confront some of the unprecedented challenges. So the next slide, I wanted to just put together an overview of the report, the latest report last year from the Sustainable Goals, which showed how the pandemic has significantly held back the progress made by many countries in achieving the goals, and the global crisis has certainly challenged children's education. So if you look at this slide, some of the headline figures tells us that, you know, more than 190 countries, for instance, have implemented nationwide school closures. And the disruptions caused by the pandemic has meant that as many as 40 million children worldwide has effectively missed out on the early childhood education, particularly during the critical preschool years. And we all know, as experts in the field, that, you know, how detrimental that would be, particularly for the most vulnerable. So inequalities in education have certainly been exacerbated across the world. And the reality is that, you know, I think although the pandemic, of course, affects every person and community, it does so unequally. And I wanted to just share with you a quote from the Sustainable Development Goals report in the next slide, which talks about how children and youth in vulnerable and disadvantaged community are particularly at risk of educational exclusion, and the pandemic is deepening the education crisis and widening existing educational inequalities. So as I said earlier, the reality is that, of course, although the pandemic affects every person and communities in different ways, it does so very unequally. So if anything, you know, given the stark inequalities, I think the real question is, what can we do and what can be done to tackle educational disadvantage? And what are the key issues and challenges? Now, when we think about educational disadvantage and tackling disadvantage, I think there are generally two broad approaches from the research that we know in the field. The next slide, please. And essentially, as kind of an overview, you know, many countries and governments think about tackling disadvantage through two approaches. One is targeted early intervention, so identifying exactly where those early intervention and support measures need to put in place at a very early age, or providing universal entitlement of early childhood education for children. So basically, do we target the most vulnerable and treat all children equally, or both? You know, or we provide early childhood education for all children, or do we focus on the most vulnerable? And I think that's a fundamental question that all countries, all governments have to address. And there is evidence from both. So I do apologize, this slide seems a bit, you know, verbose, but I thought it's important to share with you some of the evidence. And many of you would probably be familiar with the research around this. We know that high quality early childhood programs, for instance, targeting disadvantaged groups, can have lasting benefits and investment on society. However, we also need to be aware that the evidence is based on programs targeted for different age groups for different amounts of time, and the benefits that they show are not always the same. So as we know, research is important, but the reproducibility and the effect of each particular study may not be, and often will not be, the same for every target population. So I think the point I'm trying to make is, while there is evidence, we've also got to be discerning into how we use the evidence around targeted interventions. And we also, of course, we do know some early intervention programs work, some do not work. And of course, you know, what works in one context doesn't necessarily work in the other. Now, there is also evidence which shows universal quality childhood, early childhood programs can benefit children from disadvantaged backgrounds, especially when the program starts early, it's intensive, and it's of good quality. And some of the references here, you know, I'm sure some of you would be familiar with. For instance, the well-known EPI study in England shows very clear evidence of this. But essentially, putting it together, what the research tells us is that we do know now that quality early childhood education can have what is often described as a multiplier effect on young children's development outcomes and later trajectories. So whether or not governments take a more targeted early intervention approach or universal entitlement, the key element here is about quality early childhood programs that will make a difference for young children's later trajectory. Now, however, I think that the question of which approach to take is also a very complex one, is it not? And I think it is underpinned by some fundamental questions which all societies have to face. And I just wanted to share some of these questions with you in the next slide, because I think this is something that we constantly have to think about. And I certainly do when I think about my own research and what we try and support children and families in different contexts. So I think some of the questions are, what do we value about education, essentially, and what is it for? So a very philosophical question, but I think a very important one for us to consider. What types of early years services and of what quality, and how should we deliver early childhood care and education service? How should it be organized and delivered? And every country and every context is different. But that how question, I think, is really important, because it will guide societies in thinking about how we want to best deliver the service to make sure that the most vulnerable we are able to access it. And then why should we prioritize early childhood education above any other phase of education? So I started earlier by saying we do have the evidence, but I think it's also an evidence that we need to keep reminding and reinforcing, as I'm sure all of you would experience in different groups, about the importance of the younger years. And also, do we want an educational system that's driven for and by the economy? Because a lot of the arguments out there is about how early childhood education can provide returns for the investment, but that is not necessarily the only end goal. And then also, in what ways can we cater for children with educational needs? I think that's a really important question to ask. And what if children, as we know, have very diverse needs? Will children be marked as educational failure if for various reasons they do not quite fit into the system? So I don't have the answers, but I wanted to pose these questions because these are, I think, fundamental questions for us to consider as a field and as a society. So as a field of research, I think our pursuit in tackling educational disadvantage, often takes on a very strong instrumental purpose. And this has given rise, what I think, to a very dominant discourse that revolves around measuring impact and outcomes. So in the next slide, I think about some of the, and I'm sure it's the same in Belfast and in the UK, where you can see a lot of research being driven by, what is the impact that a certain program achieves, or what is the outcome. And it takes on a very strong rhetoric, what I call a kind of a what works agenda. And the question I often ask is, which measurement approach is most likely to increase attention and to gain national investment in rolling up quality programs for children? So from a policy perspective, this is another quote that I wanted to share with all of you. Measuring early childhood development is essential, because from a policy perspective, measuring can form the basis of decisions to promote the survival and the positive physical, cognitive, emotional, and educational development of children at various levels. So, a lot of the rhetoric is about measuring, quite rightly, to understand whether certain programs are working and why it's working, and if it does work, what are the outcomes and what are the impact, which in principle, we have no arguments about. And I think it's important in any research or intervention program to be able to document impact. However, I think the argument I like to, the question that I like to put forward is, the emphasis on this measuring impact and outcomes has also given rise to new issues and challenges, where I think the overemphasis on measuring and assessing early childhood education has almost become a very central preoccupation for many researchers and also for many practitioners. So for instance, I think about my own line of work and all of us who perhaps are immersed in research, a prerequisite for many funding councils is that, each project should lead to some form of documented sustainable results, and the demand for evidence has led to like I said, a preoccupation for auditable outputs from a study or intervention. And that, I think, has driven a lot of how research in the field has taken place. So to give one example of what I mean, I wanted to just refer to a project that I worked on a year ago called the World Bank Early Learning Partnership Program. And that's on the next slide. And I thought this is a really interesting case in point to share with you. And this program is basically a US $30.8 million portfolio of early childhood programs that has been implemented across 26 countries in Africa and South Africa, Africa and South Asia. And I'm just giving a very quick overview of the project. And you can see, the 26 countries that the project worked across. Some are very diverse settings, some are very socioeconomically settings where there's a lot of disadvantage, and the aim of the program is essentially to improve early learning opportunities and outcomes for young children in this developing context through attempts to scale up large-scale quality early childhood provision. So basically, what the World Bank has done is provided a large sum of money to roll out some of these different early learning programs across these countries. And what the research has done, the team and I, is to evaluate, and we are being asked to evaluate the effectiveness of these programs. And to give examples of some of these programs, in the next slide, I've given just three very quick examples. So for instance, the World Bank has funded, a training young women in early childhood development program in Liberia. In India, they've got a program that looks at strengthening early grade learning, which is early learning. And then, in Afghanistan, Bangladesh, these are some of the different programs that the funding has been used essentially to improve inequality and, and also improve children's access to education and essentially to tackle educational disadvantage. Now, the task for us as a research team then is to monitor and to try and document the potential impact of some of these programs. So what we did was we developed a tracking tool. And on the next slide, it gives you, I'm sorry, the print is not very large, but essentially it's a tool that we've developed to try and evaluate the outcomes and the impact of some of these programs. And we tried to capture impact according to 5 categories or 5 quality dimensions. Efficiency, relevance to start with. So whether the particular program is relevant for the country context and priorities. Efficiency, in terms of improving access. Impact, what impact has it achieved in terms of, for instance, capacity building. And then finally, sustainability. To what extent does the program or service can continue to serve the children and the young children and the families in the longer term. And what we did is also to then measure the impact according to 3 dimensions. And it's the other diagram on your right, which is to look at impact in terms of conceptual impact, instrumental impact, and capacity building. So what we did was to try and assess outcomes and measure impact of the programs according to these categories. Now, this is where I think, the tensions lies, because being very close to the project, I can tell you that despite our best efforts to measure impact and outcomes, there's always challenges and tensions, and to some extent problematic, because while the indicators on the tracking tool that you can see offer a kind of a high level meta-analysis of how early childhood development are developing and evolving across the countries, they don't reveal everything. So at best, what we have is a tool that gives us some overview of where different countries are in trying to tackle disadvantage, but at best it's a proxy measure to try and track some of the development of these programs over time. And it doesn't fully take into account the real distinctive context and influences on children's learning, and nor does it take into account the more hidden aspects of learning. And we all know as educators, children's learning takes place in so many different forms, and sometimes in forms that we may not necessarily be visible, that would be very hard to capture even with the most robust tool that we've developed. So to conceptualize this, so this is a very quick snapshot of a project that attempts to measure impact and outcomes. But I think what it has also unearthed for us is more questions around, what are we actually trying to achieve in terms of evidencing impact and outcomes? And this slide, I thought was really helpful in conceptualizing our thinking, where it talks about at the level of research artifacts, tools such as this. The next slide, please. Research into the politics of methods has shown how assumptions about what counts as evidence are embedded in specific tools. So we ourselves as researchers have to be very mindful of the assumptions that we bring when we track or try and measure outcomes and impact. So essentially, the real question, I think, is what counts as evidence? So the research, I think, is useful as an example in how highlighting what I think is common misperception or misalignment between outcome and impact, and where outcome assessment is commonly mistaken for evidence of impact or quality assurance. So the next slide, please. So, I think this is very instrumental in terms of our own reflection. Are there other ways of evidencing early learning that we can consider other than through outcome assessments? And what does the evidence mean for the people who collect it, and who benefits, and what is it for? So, I think whether you're an educator or you're a researcher or you're a practitioner or a teacher, I think that's a really important question to ask. If you're trying to document children's learning and you're trying to document evidence of how learning has taken place, the question is, who are you actually collecting it for? And why? And who is actually going to benefit it? Because when you ask those questions, then perhaps the way you document and the way you try and collect those evidence will be different. And I just wanted to put in a quote here from, the Nobel Prize winner, Amartya Sen, when he talks about how the power to do good, as we all try and do to tackle disadvantage, almost always also comes with the possibility of doing the opposite. So I think it's important for us to problematize and think about that. And then in terms of tackling disadvantage, there are some elements that I just think, it's important for us to consider. The next slide. In the sense that I've encapsulated this in my talk, children's learning is complex, it's multifaceted, it's not always amenable to quantitative measuring and monitoring. It's very hard to measure every nugget of knowledge that children have, for instance. The importance of recognizing multiple contexts and the social and relational cultural context that children grow up and learn is very important. And moving beyond what I think it's important to move beyond a measurement and monitoring paradigm and think about new conceptual and methodological approaches to researching early childhood education. So it's about, I think, out of the challenge comes an opportunity for us to rethink our work as researchers, to think beyond not just measuring, but what exactly are we trying to achieve and measure. And so I hope this has been helpful, because really what I wanted to capture is some of my reflections around the difficulties, but also the opportunities in capturing children's learning to tackle disadvantage. And I'm coming to my final slide now, and I just wanted to end on a hopeful note for all of us as a field to think about, what our role is. And I often refer to this quote in my own work. And a quote from one of the great educators, the Brazilian educator, some of you may come across his work, Paulo Freire. And I just find, his work so inspiring, because he really challenged me as an educator, as a researcher, to thinking more deeply about my role. And Freire made me reimagine the future of education. And so this is a quote from his book, The Pedagogy of Hope, where he wrote about hope and education. And he says, ultimately, it is about the society we would love to shape for our children, and that which we would like our children to shape. And then education is much more than a technique. Education is an understanding of the world in order to transform it. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for such a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. It was so good to be reminded right from the outset that we have come so far in the field of early childhood education, but that we can't rest on our laurels, that we have still so much to do in terms of tackling educational disadvantage. You've raised some really fundamental questions, and you've also provided us with really, really sound advice, particularly with regard to that area of evidence. What actually do we mean as evidence? And perhaps the need to be mindful of an overemphasis on measuring outcomes and impacts and putting the emphasis back on the young child right at the heart of what each and every one of us is actually trying to do. So thank you so much once again, Lynn. An absolute pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. At this point now, we turn our attention to our panel. And I'm delighted that we have some really eminent speakers for our panel as well. And we have Dr. Helen Lewis, who's all the way from the University of Swansea in Wales. We have Dr. Laura Bronson, who's even further afield as well, away from the United States, from the University of Northwestern. Then Dr. Leah O'Toole from Maynooth University, right in the Republic of Ireland, not that far away. Then Dr. Barbara McConnell, who's much closer to home from Stranmillis University College itself. And then last but not least, Dr. Liz Chesworth from the University of Sheffield. We're going to move straight on to the panel speakers now, and we're going to commence with Dr. Helen Lewis's presentation in the first instance, and then we'll come back, we'll move through each of the panel speakers, and then we'll come back to the questions and discussion at the end. So over to you, Helen. We're delighted to have you with us this afternoon.
Oh, thank you, Glenda, and I'm delighted to be here. Prynhawn da, everybody. It's lovely to have the chance to speak to you. As Glenda said, my name is Helen Lewis. I'm based in the Department of Education in Swansea University, and I'm just going to try and do two things in 5 minutes this afternoon. Glenda, you'll have to wave at me if I go over, because this is something I could speak for a very long time about. I'm just going to highlight a little bit about the context of Wales, but I'm actually then going to spend some time talking about some research that we've been doing, which has been funded by the British Academy. And I think it actually picks up on several of the things that Lynn mentioned in her keynote, in particular looking at social relationships, but relationships that children can have with non-human playmates and participants, because this is a fascinating area of study. So just to give you a little bit of an outline, a recent presentation by Children in Wales outlined that actually, in terms of disadvantage, there are many children coming into our early childhood settings in Wales, coming from considerable backgrounds that are going to make it difficult for them in those initial stages of their education. And we know for a fact that the impact of COVID here in Wales is going to be significant for many children. The practical, reality of this is that many children are coming into their schools facing some significant barriers to education. And in practice, in a typical classroom setting, there are likely to be 7 children who are at least 7 children who are facing considerable challenges before they even start looking at their learning. So recently, the Welsh Government has been looking at a number of different ways to support learners and their families. And in terms of early years, we have access to specific grants and support. And there has been guidance for teachers and practitioners about the kinds of interventions that might be particularly useful within early contexts. And I'm sure that if you have a little look at this, some of the sort of suggestions here, there won't be anything here that you wouldn't expect to see. But what we've been exploring is whether building on children's interest and curiosity in animals can actually be a novel application and a novel way to support social and emotional learning, to develop speech and language, to encourage children to regulate, and also to communicate purposefully and about something that is meaningful to them. In terms of a rationale, then, we know that this isn't appropriate for everybody. We know that not everybody is an animal lover. There can be cultural, there can be medical reasons, for example, why children can't engage with animals. But typically speaking, there is something that does engage many, many children in terms of their interest and fascination for creatures of all shapes and sizes. And the research would suggest that actually, whereas as adults, we may look at animals for a number of reasons in terms of what that relationship can do for us as an individual or as a society, for animals and young children, it's often a relationship just based on fascination. And I think as an early years educator, that's got to be something really, really powerful for us to build on. And of course, even if children don't have first-hand experiences with companion animals in the home, we know that they are all around them. If we think about the books that you might have in your setting that children encounter, the television programs that they might be watching, the characters that they come across, there's a very high possibility that animals will feature in those sorts of settings and contexts. So in terms of what we've been looking at, we've been thinking about the potential that animals can bring really for well-being and social interactions. We know that many children who are coming in from disadvantaged backgrounds may find these aspects particularly difficult. We also know that animals don't prejudge children. They don't make any judgments based on backgrounds or anything like that. They react in the moment and they can form bonds with all children. So we've been looking to see whether there are possibilities for children to engage in social interactions with animals as friends and as catalysts for conversations, and also because the presence of an animal does in fact impact on the classroom and setting environment itself. We know it might impact on the emotional environment, for example, because if you learn to interact with an animal, you learn to be calmer and to be quieter, and that can really bring a sense of peace into the classroom environment. It can, of course, also bring a sense of complete chaos, like when I took my dog in a few weeks ago. It was a very busy environment, but we learned together how to regulate that and how to behave calmly and quietly. So just to give you an example from one of the preschool settings that we've been working in, this is a picture of Honey, the golden retriever. She's a rescue dog. She came from a very difficult background, but with love and care, she developed and flourished and became a fantastic member of this preschool setting, encouraging children to talk authentically for a purpose. They were talking to Honey, they were talking about Honey to peers and to other adults. They were also advocating for Honey, so thinking about what she might need, what she might want, and developing those communication skills. And I think that sense of kindness, of empathy, Lynn mentioned something about thinking about the society that we hope our children can be shaping. Those skills of kindness and empathy and tolerance, they're really important life skills moving forward. We saw examples of children who'd been non-verbal, actually communicating, working together, organizing themselves, taking turns, negotiating, learning about how to keep an animal healthy and happy, really important skills. And we also saw the fact that Honey was there as a real opportunity for parental engagement. Parents were really keen to come into the setting, to find out what had been going on, and to come and meet Honey themselves. So there were a whole range of different reasons why having Honey here in the setting was really important. I could talk about this for hours and hours, but I'm just going to sum up very quickly and say, I think there is a huge opportunity here to explore the potential that human-animal connections can have in early years settings, and for children for whom perhaps coming into a setting is difficult, who may have barriers to their learning. But we do have to be cautious, and we do have to respect the animal as well as the individual. You know, all of the messages for early childhood educators about advocacy, children's rights, all of those really valuable things that we hold so dear to us are absolutely true of the animal participants as well. So we have to ask ourselves certain questions. What's the job if the animal is working perhaps with children with some behavioural challenges? We need to select an animal who's going to cope very well with those particular situations and those particular children. Not all animals are the same. We cannot assume that a family dog is going to adapt to the challenges of a setting easily. So we have to look at individual personalities, and we have to look at the expectations. But from our research, what I would say is that if you can find the right animal and the right group of children and the right kind of setting, there are some really interesting possibilities, particularly to do with well-being, social skills, and communication that can come from this kind of opportunity and this kind of interaction. So I'm going to stop there because I think that must be my 5 minutes up, Glenda. It was a whistle-stop tour. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about this.
Thank you so very much, Helen. Fascinating stuff. I think every early childhood setting needs a honey. I know I have no better friend than my own little four-legged friend, Sparky. So thank you so much for that. And now we pass over to Dr. Laura Bronson. Over to you, Lara.
All right, thank you, everyone. I am here in the US and the sun is just coming up. The sun just started shining in my window, so it's 7:44 in the morning here. And I'm thrilled to be here. So thank you to Stranmillis for inviting me, and for Professor Ang for your research that you shared. I appreciate hearing all of the context that you brought. And it is amazing how it parallels what I've prepared as well, as we just heard. So I will dive in. My background, I taught kindergarten for 7 years, and then I went into teacher preparation. So I've been at the University of Northwestern in Minnesota in the United States for the past 15 years. And I just love working with elementary ed and early childhood ed majors in my role as assistant dean and professor here at the school, in the School of Education. So I will begin my presentation here. All right, I'd like to start with a quote. Given the events of the past 2 years, as well as research around what is developmentally appropriate, it is more important than ever to emphasize social emotional well-being, learning through play, and a culturally relevant whole child approach when planning instruction. This quote was brought to me from the Minnesota Department of Education Early Learning Office, and I work in parallel with them. We know that when play is integrated into learning, children develop problem-solving skills, expand and refine their understanding, their language use, learn about their world, they try out different roles, and they adjust to working with others. So I bet we can agree that we do want to emphasize the play-based social emotional learning. And I think, like we just heard, working with honey or other experiences would be a great way to do that. You know, in Minnesota, we just got some data that we thought was really eye-opening, and I wanted to share these statistics with you today. We noticed a significant drop of children enrolling in our publicly funded early childhood education programs and our kindergartens across the state. So it had to ask us what caused this drop in enrollment. Well, teachers shared that many families waited to enroll their children based on the masking decisions that each individual center or school were making. And if masks were required, many families unenrolled their children. Some definitely kept them in, but there was a decrease when masks were involved. So the pandemic is certainly a part of that. Research is telling us that more affluent families are choosing play-based early childhood experiences with an emphasis on art, music, and nature, rather than enroll them in state-funded programs where teachers are more known to practice drilling children on basic skills. Higher income families are not choosing this kind of preparation, one researcher recently explained. And why would we assume that we need to train children of lower income families differently? I think those are great questions to ask. So what can we do to tackle the disadvantage? That's the theme of our summit here today. You know, here are a few do's and don'ts from the research that I've recently been reading and been a part of. One, in Minnesota, we're really focused in on individual screen time. I think it's interesting. Individual screens can, of course, support and enhance learning when used in an age-appropriate way. Screen use should include engagement from adults and peers, be interactive, and be used in combination with other educational tools to support learning. Here in my state of Minnesota, there is new legislation to enforce this practice to make sure that teachers are using screens in developmentally appropriate ways. From 2002 to 2015, our No Child Left Behind law caused schools and districts to shift away from recess and focus more on preparing students to perform well on their standardized tests. Children, of course, we know need recess now more than ever, considering they've grown up in the COVID-19 pandemic. Well, it's one of the largest mass trauma events since World War II. So while recess used to be viewed as something that took away from learning, experts now have come to understand, of course, that recess can improve children's focus and success in the classroom and providing them a well-needed break. In a recent survey, school district leaders named mental health of students and staff as their top concern over any other school issue. Recess benefits not just academics, but also students' mental health and their social emotional learning. Being intentional with recess time is critical to help children deal with trauma, feel rested, and be ready to engage in schoolwork. And I'd also like to highlight a recent study by Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. The researchers found that low-income children who attend their state-funded voluntary pre-K programs during the 2009 and 10 and 2010-11 school years, 6 years later, were doing worse than their peers by the end of 6th grade in academic achievement, discipline issues, and special education referrals. One of the authors of the study concluded, the settings of pre-K that our low-income children are going into are not good for them long-term. Those negative pre-K experiences included more whole group instruction, more teachers talking at students, and more rigid behavioral controls. The more quality programs included more time for children to play, more opportunities for teachers to listen to children, and provided a sense of care and belonging for children to experience each day. We have to move beyond believing that children are either ready or not ready for preschool or kindergarten. For example, in Minnesota, we've transitioned away from the phrase kindergarten readiness to now we call it the kindergarten transition, focusing on age eligibility versus the idea that some children are ready and some children aren't ready. And in closing in this time, I just would like to share what my colleagues in the field, both teachers and administrators, are sharing about their recent interactions with young learners. Overall, they feel that students appear to be, maybe this echoes what you feel, teachers, less mature than in the past, that preschool experiences are more varied than ever, and that there's a huge range in skills and abilities. Children who were online learners in 2020, 2021 are exhibiting less independence today. Their advice is that we celebrate the growth of each individual learner rather than meeting the school mandated academic benchmarks. Children will rise up to our beliefs and their abilities when we celebrate the little milestones in each developmental domain. Let's celebrate their growth together in a collaborative spirit as we tackle these disadvantages together. Thank you so much. I look forward to our question time. And if anyone has questions about my resources, I'd be happy to share those.
Thank you so much, Lara. Another really interesting presentation, and I couldn't agree more with the power of play in helping to tackle educational disadvantage in practice. So thank you so much for that. We now move on to Dr. Leah O'Toole.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I've managed to make a mistake here, of course, just as I log into you. Just bear with me a second.
Don't you worry at all. You're 100% fine.
The joys of technology, eh? Thanks so much, Glenda, and thanks to the previous excellent speakers. A hard act to follow. My name is Dr. Leah O'Toole, and I'm with you today from the Federal Department of Primary and Early Childhood Education in Maynooth University. I have a background in psychology and early childhood education, and I'm the mum of 3 wild but gorgeous children, I think, anyway, maybe a little biased. My research interests in early childhood education are quite broad, but I was really pleased to be invited to take part today because a kind of a common theme across my work and my interests is really around the transformative potential of early childhood education and the idea of early childhood education as an element of social justice. I was thinking before joining you here today about what element of that work to share, and I thought what I might begin with is just a quick look at the sort of theoretical work that influences a lot of what we do here in early childhood in the Republic of Ireland. I'm very influenced by the work of Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who, as you're probably aware, was one of the first psychological theorists to really emphasize children's development in the midst of their families, their communities, their societies. Now, no doubt those of you from different disciplinary backgrounds like sociology and anthropology and early childhood education generally are thinking, yeah, weren't the psychologists a little bit slow to catch on to that? And indeed, that's a fair comment. But what I'm really interested in terms of bioecological theory is this idea of the scholar activist. So that it's the responsibility of academics to really engage with policymakers and to use our academic work to ameliorate the problems that face our societies. So the title of today's session around Towards a Fair Start for All would definitely be relevant here. Bronfenbrenner himself was involved in establishing Head Start in the 60s, which, based on the distinction that Professor Ang was making, was very much a targeted early intervention, but yet still argued for the potential of early childhood education for all children. Those of you who've come across Bronfenbrenner's work before are probably very much aware of the kind of the concentric circles and different levels of context, but I'm more interested recently in the idea of proximal processes, which are the interactions and relationships with people and objects and symbols. And to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about here, I don't know now we'll be able to hear this because I don't know, can you hear anything there? You may not, but even still, by the movement there, you can see this is with thanks to my little guy at home, Killian, for as I say, I don't know if you could hear any of that, but what was going on there was Killian kind of splashing in the puddles, looking up, having a conversation with me about what's happening. And just that interaction with the world, I think, is just so illustrative of how learning and development can happen in, as they call it in advertising, the wonderful everyday. And Bronfenbrenner would have talked about these kind of interactions as the engines of development. Now, there's lots and lots of different types, obviously, of interactions and relationships. And certainly, Helen's discussion of social interactions with animals, I thought was a fascinating form of proximal processes. But there was a couple that I thought I'd just focus on today in relation to support for overcoming educational disadvantage. And one is the idea of outdoor play. So we know increasingly that access to active play in nature and outdoors gives opportunities for these very developmentally generative proximal processes that just aren't available through other means. And for some children, they're very lucky. You can see the same guy who was just splashing in the puddle there is the first person on the tree. But we know that for many children, that kind of access to outdoors and to nature isn't quite as available. And it becomes then a really social justice issue as far as I can see, because it's impinging on children's protection and participation rights if they don't have this access to nature or outdoor play. So again, drawing on our understanding of what's gone on in COVID-19, there were so many children who maybe were in balconies or who just didn't have access to parks or to outdoor space that were really very much impacted by this. It's an increasing issue of concern, not only with COVID-19, but increased screen time, more sedentary lifestyles. And for very many children, sometimes the only access to outdoor play they have is through early childhood education. So that gives us an idea of how our early childhood provision can start to really make a difference in the lives of children. The other type of proximal process that I just thought I'd draw attention to in regards to educational disadvantage is the basic human relationships that happen every day. I mean, I couldn't agree more with Lara, who talked about play, care, and belonging as being the hallmarks of really high quality early childhood education. And what's interesting about a bioecological perspective is that Bronfenbrenner identifies the power of these relationships to overcome even very difficult contextual factors. So we've all heard of the idea of the one good adult, you know, and that even in very challenging situations, those interactions and relationships can be so supportive in terms of children reaching their potential. In terms of locating then this in the Irish Republic of Ireland context, we're really starting to recognise this, the importance of interactions and relationships. So for example, in our early childhood curriculum framework, ASHTR, there's a real focus on relationships and children's fundamental need to be with other people and learning and developing through nurturing relationships. Our quality framework, the same, highlights the importance of responsive, sensitive and reciprocal relationships consistent over time. That could have been written by Bronfenbrenner, actually. It's a really good definition of proximal processes. Our most recent policy in relation to this is the First Five policy. And again, there's quite an emphasis on relationships. There's also, interestingly, the most recent development on that is a new funding model that has just been released in the last couple of months. And it again focuses in quite a lot on, you know, a targeted model for overcoming children experiencing disadvantage and yet locating that within a universal approach. There's still lots of room for improvement, of course. Myself and others here, Glenda, colleagues in Stranmillis and with Early Childhood Ireland are currently working on a piece of work that's been funded by our National Council for Curriculum and Assessment to consult with babies, toddlers and young children on their experiences of ASHTR, our curriculum framework, and updating it based on their voices. So we're really excited about that piece of work. I think it's a really important potential contribution to Irish curriculum. But there are still problems in terms of, you know, relationships and interactions and the understanding of their crucial nature. I mean, Lynn noted that about, you know, what are we actually measuring here and who are we measuring it for? And that's certainly anecdotally the experience of many early childhood educators, that these relationships get sidelined in inspection processes. Equally, First Five policy is very clear on parental relationships, but not so much on pedagogical relationships, and actually has removed the word education from the title of the sector. So that didn't go down very well, as you can imagine. They're now calling it early learning and care rather than early childhood education and care. And this new funding model is still very much located within a business model of early childhood. So we do still have a bit of a way to go. But I suppose the focus of what I've been trying to put forward today is that in tackling educational disadvantage in the early years, it's all about relationships. So that's me. Thank you for your attention. And I'll try and
Leah,
stop sharing.
So much, and I couldn't agree more. It's definitely all about those relationships, whether it be relationships with other human beings, or even, as we've learned this afternoon, relationships with our animal friends as well. So thank you for that. Now we'll move on to Barbara, Dr. Barbara McConnell, my colleague from Stranmillis. So what do you, Barbara?
Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you now, Barbara. Over to you.
Sorry, apologies for that. Thank you very much for inviting me along today and for giving me the opportunity to speak after you know, such wonderful speakers. And as I'm listening, I'm noting down notes as I'm talking through, which hopefully links in with what I'm going to talk about today. Glenda just asked me to talk a little bit about tackling educational disadvantage in the early years in the Northern Ireland context. And that's hopefully what I am intending to do if this goes on. So really to think about the Northern Ireland context, I think we have to go back and think about the early years policy really, and think about where we have been and where we have travelled in the last sort of 10 to 15 years. And to tackling educational disadvantage, we kind of go back to the 0 to 6 strategy in 2010 that the Department of Education developed. Actually, probably think in 2006 when Department of Education took the lead department for all of this work, but really they put out the 0 to 6 strategy in 2010, and they put that out for consultation, and they were, you know, overwhelmed with the response to that consultation. You know, most people agreeing in part of what they were asking to do, but actually asking questions how they were going to do that. And it's setting up a working party to sort of take the feedback on that. And I know I represented Stranmillis on that group. They came out with the Learning to Learn framework in 2012. And that was really the beginning to start about tackling some of this cross-departmental working, because that policy, or the Learning to Learn framework, really shaped the focus from the preschool age and a little bit of work within the Sure Start area. So I suppose that was the beginning of us starting to think about targeted services. And it was really interested with Professor Lynn talking about the difference between universal and targeted provision. And I think that is something that we in Northern Ireland have grappled with for a long time. And Sure Start being the big focus really on tackling educational disadvantage. But certainly that was the beginning of the expansion of Sure Start, and that work has continued. And we've looked at, you know, we've had more Sure Starts developed over the years, and we've had a number of evaluations of Sure Start highlighting certainly the good work that Sure Start is doing, but always with that caveat that it's not accessible for everyone. But the other stream that kind of came out of the Learning to Learn framework was this need for the preschoolers, the under 3s, and the need for that the Department of Education can't work, you know, can't do all of this work. And there was the sort of the agreement for cross-departmental working. And that was the beginning of a number of programs starting to come out, some of them being universal in provision. One of them, I've put a couple of examples there, the EITP, which was a suite of programs, which was the Early Intervention Transformation Program, where we had programs such as Getting Ready for Baby, Getting Ready for Toddler, Getting Ready to Learn. So the Getting Ready for Baby, the Department of Health took the lead on that program, and it was really focusing into the antenatal classes and changing the provision there. Rather than getting ready to have a baby on a particular day, it was about getting ready to become a parent and support the learning and support the development of children. Getting Ready for Toddler was focusing for early identification at a universal level for the preschool sector, and also being able to pick out those children that weren't meeting developmental milestones. And then Getting Ready to Learn was a program that Department of Education ran, very much about supporting parents and about the need then this was the move for Department of Education to really try to help parents realize the role. This was kind of us thinking about the 1001 days and acknowledging the importance of supporting work, you know, supporting parents to support their learning. So this work for supporting families really has been the journey of direction, and certainly where Department of Health and Department of Education have been working together. You know, so for example, a lot of particular groups have been targeted. One that I certainly am involved in at the moment is working with the Public Health Agency and a number of multidisciplinary work around infant mental health and promoting the infant mental health framework. And just listening to the previous speaker, they're talking about the importance of relationships. I mean, this infant mental health training is supporting for parents about really developing those strong relationships from a very young age. Another very recent element that has been helping there to you know, kind of target groups that would particularly have struggled in the system. You will be aware Northern Ireland had the earliest school starting age, and it was a very rigid program. And literally yesterday, it just went through policy where we have a more flexible approach to school starting age, where particular groups, for example, maybe premature babies, have that flexibility about when they start school to enable them to have a longer time in the preschool setting. Another group that was renowned for having a challenge will be looked after children, or children looked after. And certainly I know I'm involved in some work with the Education Authority at the moment, looking to support preschool teachers and practitioners in training in order to make sure that their provision really meets the needs of these particular vulnerable group. And of course, this moves us round to what Noel talked about at the beginning about the Fair Start report that was launched last year. And, we were certainly in early childhood studies so delighted to see, that early years and the refocusing onto the early years was, number one priority, and that every child, should have an appropriate level of support and need in a timely manner. So again, moving into hopefully more of a universal approach to the work. So really, again, I was interested there that Leah talks about the first 5, and I thought I was stealing the big 5 from the Duchess of Cambridge when she launched the research, and Glenda and I were involved in that. Just to summarise where I see the direction of travel in Northern Ireland with regard to tackling underachievement. There certainly is a focus on early intervention, and I think that is important. There's been a certain, a real direction and support for parents, recognising that they are the first educators and they need support in supporting their children to learn. About targeting need early, and absolutely the work of Sure Start has been crucial, but that needs to be widened out, that not every child who needs support lives within a Sure Start area. The cross-departmental working is certainly working well, and that is a continued direction. And I suppose the last point then, from our own point of view, is still that we have this split system in Northern Ireland, and we still do not have early years provision run by graduate workforce. And we know from our EPNI research that graduates will make a difference. And I'm ending with a picture of some of our current graduates from Stranmillis a couple of weeks ago, leading a group of from babies right the way up through Stormont to meet our policymakers, advocating for children to make the daily mile embed it within the curriculum. And it was so interesting to listen to the American there who was talking about reducing the recess down. And I mean, we are really have the work that we're doing at the moment, showing how, children involved in the daily mile, how important that is. It's a really important time to check in with children. And we see here our graduates being advocates for children and speaking to policy. So apologies, I see Glenda there is jumping in, so I'm over my time, but thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Another brilliant presentation. Thank you for that. And we do live in optimistic times in Northern Ireland at the minute where early years is concerned, thanks to the Fair Start report. And we look forward to early years being at the centre of our policy decisions, hopefully in due course in that respect. So thank you so much, Barbara. And then last but not least, over to our final panel speaker, Dr. Liz Chesworth from the University of Sheffield. Over to you, Liz.
Hi, Glenda. Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to join today's session. I'm afraid I did join a little bit late because I've just come straight from teaching and someone has very kindly put my slides up. I think that probably means I have to sort of request someone moves them on. So hopefully someone can help with that. And I'm really sorry for the inconvenience. So yeah, thanks for the welcome and the introduction, Glenda. My name's Liz Chesworth and I work at the University of Sheffield in England. I've been working here in Sheffield for about 6 years. Before that, I led a teacher education early childhood programme. And before that, I worked as an early years teacher for about 15 years in a range of schools and early years settings that I guess probably all would be described as serving disadvantaged communities in some ways. So I'm just going to spend my few minutes
just talking about some very recent work and actually some current work as well that I'm working on in terms of research that I think very much resonates with some of the key ideas that have been explored this afternoon in terms of the role of early childhood in tackling disadvantage, and what practices and approaches do we need to think about and perhaps problematize in order to ensure that early education is meaningful, relevant, respectful, and inclusive of all children. So I think my work is very much building on the work and emphasis on relationships that's already been emphasized. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the questions that I'm exploring in my my current and my very recent work is working very closely with teachers and with children and with families in settings that I've described here as super diverse. So areas where there's a sort of quite a big movement of people within the area. And just to give an example, in Wingfield Primary School, where I'm working at the moment, within the early year, the foundation stage setting, there are 70 children. And those 70 children between them speak 39 different languages. So that's just a reflection of that super diversity. And within that context, we're exploring how the teacher's curriculum decision-making can reflect the complexity and the diversity of young children's learning. And in particular, I'm very interested in children's interests and the interests they explore in their play. So we're thinking about how educators can recognise, respect and respond to that wide variety of interests that children bring with them from home contexts into the classroom. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the theoretical ideas that I draw upon are really based on sort of socio-cultural theory, so recognising the importance of children's social and cultural everyday lives with their families, in their communities and in their classrooms. And we've been using some of those ideas associated with that theory to look really closely at our observations of children's play, and then thinking about it when we share these observations with the children and with the children's families, how we can gain a deeper understanding of the interests that children are bringing to their play and exploring in their play, and in particular, how those interests connect with their experiences at home and in the community. And then we're using that information to think about how curriculum planning can resonate and build more closely on that great diversity of experiences that children are bringing with them from all those different home contexts. And next slide, please. So I just wanted to identify two sort of knotty issues, particular challenges that we've encountered within this project that I think has got direct implications and needs some further thought in terms of thinking about tackling disadvantage. So in the English system, the early years foundation stage framework draws on a long history in England of sort of child-centered practices, of being responsive to children's interests. But what we found is that in reality, teachers, and I would include myself in this, we find it easier to notice and respond to children's interests that kind of resonate with our own life experiences and our own social and cultural practices. And actually in the research that I've just finished, educators sometimes didn't notice quite so easily children's interests and the knowledge that children were bringing from contexts that were maybe somewhat different to their own lived experiences. So a key reflection point, I think, that we all need to think about in terms of, really genuinely tackling disadvantaged is that if we are going to ascribe, which I really hope that we do, to a play-based, interest-based curriculum, then we really need to make sure that that is inclusive of all children's interests and all children's lived experiences. And again, that goes back to the importance of relationships, doesn't it? That those sort of Bronfenbrenner systems and the relationships between home and early years settings. And the second, which I've already heard other people touching upon, the second issue is that in England, we've very much got a data-driven, outcome-driven education system that starts when children first begin education in the early years foundation stage. And what we found in this research is that if children's interests don't necessarily fit within those statutory early learning goals, then again, teachers find it more challenging to actually build on those interests. So the key reflection point from that, I guess, is that not all learning can be evidenced through those statutory outcomes or goals. It's far more complex and diverse and broad than that. Okay, the next slide, please. So we've got this dissonance in the early years foundation stage in England, where we've got this emphasis on a standardized curriculum, a data-driven approach to accountability. But at the same time, England is a really diverse country where we've got all of these dynamic and diverse sources of knowledge that inform children's interests and inquiries. So it's kind of like trying to fit all this diversity down a funnel into this very narrow approach to thinking about learning that is problematic, I think, in terms of tackling disadvantage. So final slide, please, Glenda, or whoever is kindly switching them across for me. So I just wanted to end with my hopes for young children. I've been reading the work of Kanaoki recently, who talks about this idea of curriculum making in the middle. So in other words, rather than all curriculum decision-making being driven by outcomes and goals, I wanted just to sort of pause with thinking about how we can build curriculum on recognizing all children's funds of knowledge and all children's home experiences. And as a result, how can we ensure that the experiences of children who are currently really being marginalized in the English system, how can we ensure that those children are moved to the center of curriculum making? Okay, that's me done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Liz. Another really thought-provoking presentation. And I've written here, if all educational settings were meaningful, relevant, respectful, and inclusive, surely then educational disadvantage would become a thing of the past. So thank you so much indeed, Liz. And indeed, thank you to each of our panel speakers this afternoon. So much learning to be gleaned from each and every one. So at this juncture, we now pass over to our wider audience for some questions, comments. I might ask that all of our speakers, Professor Lynn and all of our panel speakers put on their camera at this point. And then could I ask, I've checked through the chat, but I don't see any questions as yet coming to the fore. So would anybody like to pose a question or indeed make a comment at this point? And please do speak to us. Nobody's going to speak. No questions. I'm going to see from anybody in the audience that I could ask a question of at this point.
I'm just putting on my video, sorry.
So Deirdre, over to you.
Yeah, I have a question, I think, and maybe more so for Lynn, if that's okay. And I'm just looking at the Irish context in relation to early intervention and prevention. And currently we really don't have a universal standard of early intervention and across Ireland, and it's very patchy geographically across Ireland. And like that, many of, I suppose, children from marginalised communities are still actually being on the outskirts of those early intervention and prevention programmes, such as, for example, travellers and Roma children. And I'm just wondering, have you found any examples of really good international practice whereby they have a universal approach to early intervention and prevention alongside a targeted approach? So maybe, like, I was thinking maybe a tiered approach where it starts off at a universal level and then they can narrow it down to maybe target maybe children more in need, such as those, you know, and reach to the wider networks. There's a lot in my question towards infant mental health, disabilities and so on.
Absolutely, thank you. But it's a good question. So I think perhaps in my presentation, when I talked about targeted versus universal, it's perhaps not the dichotomy is not as clean as it seems, because I think in reality, all countries or all contexts apply a combination of those two approaches. So if you think about in the UK, for instance, right? So we do have what we call universal entitlement. I do apologize. I don't know the Northern Ireland context well enough, but certainly, we do have an entitlement whereby 3-4-year-olds go into settings and they are entitled to a certain number of hours of being in preschool, right? And that's funded across. But at the same time, we do know also that there are early intervention programs, particularly for children at the younger age, where before they go into perhaps primary schooling, and I think it varies quite a lot depending on the settings that they go to, where they might have targeted language and communication intervention. I worked on this project called Manor Park Talks, which I didn't have time to share with everyone, but there we looked at an intervention, not necessarily at the child level, and this is something that I wanted to get across as well, that interventions can mean a whole range of interventions, not just with the children, but also upskilling and supporting professional development of teachers, which we know is crucial. So, in this other project that I worked with, we looked at intervention to support the professional development of teachers, to support 2-year-olds in their language and communication development. So I think in reality, it is a combination of those two approaches that you need to use. And I think certainly there is evidence to show that the important thing of intervention, that it's meaningful and it's contextualized within the children's context of learning. That it's not something that's completely separate from their from their normal environment, their learning environment. And building on the child's competencies and abilities, I think that's very important. Often, we are in danger of looking at it from a kind of deficit approach, whereby we think there's always a need and we want to try and go in and intervene to try and improve learning, which fundamentally is the case. But I think it's also important to recognize the abilities that children bring to those settings.
That's great. Thanks so much, Lynn.
Okay, thank you for that. And then we have another question here in the chat from Lorna Kincaid. Do you feel educational leadership has a role to play in educational underachievement? Laura, are you targeting anybody in particular, or do you just wish for Lynn or a member of the panel to answer that for you?
Hi, Glenda. Nobody in particular, just anybody who feels they can answer.
Okay, so I'll just reiterate that again. Thank you for that, Laura. Do you feel educational leadership has a role to play in educational underachievement? Any of our panel speakers perhaps like to take that one?
Glenda, I've just actually replied in the chat there, because I think it's a really crucial point, actually, educational leadership, and particularly when you come at it from a relational lens. I think that educational leaders within settings really set the tone. They create the psychological culture, the environment, and they can either create a space where educators have the language and the confidence to put their relational practice to the fore, or equally they can kind of create an environment where their educators are worried. They're seen as, oh, I'm only spending time with the children, rather than realizing, well, that is the job, that is the work of early education. And of course, obviously, that leadership then takes place in a context. So, national policies, broader international ideas, as pointed out by Lynn, around, what are we actually measuring here? So I suppose it depends on how you define leadership. I think within the settings, definitely, at the broader policy level, definitely. But I think there's a leadership and an advocacy role for all of us involved in early childhood education to put forward these ideas and to really talk about what good quality early childhood education looks like.
Super, Leah. Thank you for that. Laura, do you wish to come back, or are you happy?
No, that's great. Thank you very much. Something that I think everybody has a role as a practitioner in the early years sector, that we do have the role for advocating for children, and it's maybe just trying to get that understanding at a leadership level of how important that role is. So, yep, that's great. Thank you very much.
Exactly that. I couldn't agree more. I know with our own students and whatever, and young sort of teachers in that sense, it's trying to get across sort of sometimes the importance of play and being able to put into practice a very sort of playful, learning focused pedagogy in that respect. And sometimes they do find it challenging if they're coming into a school that's maybe very data driven and whatever, and trying to make their own mark there in that respect. But as both you and Leah have said, we all play a very important role there. So thank you for that. Then Kim Bradley has asked the question, how do you envisage improvement for the impact of every child's disadvantage at the moment? Kim, are you around? Would you like to share that or pose that to any particular speaker?
Yeah, no, just to anyone in general. It was just because I feel the pandemic has really impacted all of their social background or what normally would have been seen as disadvantaged. So it was just for that reason. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Any speaker? Anybody wish to take that one?
Sorry, Glenn, can I come in? Is
yes,
that
Lynn,
okay?
please do.
So I think there's quite a bit of emerging research around the impact of COVID on children's school experiences, and certainly at the Institute of Education where I'm based, there's a project called the duty. Sorry, I'm trying to get the title right. Duty to Care and the Duty to Teach, and it's being led by Professor Gemma Moss, a close colleague of mine, and the team in my department. I can send the link to Glenda, who can share with everyone, or you can easily, look it up on the website. And I think it's clearly, there is research now that shows how COVID has really impacted on children's experiences with the disruption, the impact on mental health and so on. And I think, it's still, we are still living with COVID, and we not, but I think the question, to directly answer your question, the kind of hard empirical evidence is not quite yet to come, because it takes a while to actually find out what we want to measure, how we're going to measure it. And, the data is still evolving. But of course, we know anecdotally there is some impact. And despite various, kind of observations from different perhaps policymakers or government saying, oh, no, it's fine, children are back on track, I'm not convinced of that at all. Because we know from being in the settings, we know from listening to the educators and the teachers and the practitioners that we work with, that is certainly not the case. So I just want to put it out there. It's an interesting question. I think we need to look at more data, but we certainly know there is research out there that shows there is an impact, a negative impact, on learning.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you for that. We have also a question here from Noel. How do we measure the effectiveness of early years interventions? Important for funders and accountability, while not resorting to excessive testing and measurement of young children. Any examples of good practice? And again, that's for Lynn or any of the panel speakers.
So I can quickly answer that and then let the other speakers
great,
come
Lynn.
in.
I think that maybe is for you, that one.
Seems to be the heart of what I was trying to tackle. Okay, so I think the point I was trying to make is measure impact is not easy, but at the same time, and I think this is where perhaps perhaps where the impetus of the question came from, is that we do need to somehow engage with that, because that's what funders want to know. And my advice would be is that you want to be very clear what exactly you're measuring. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is to be very systematic and evidence informed in the tools that you use to measure, so that we know that it's well aligned. So you're not making a kind of a generic assessment around whether children, for instance, whether a piece of research or a piece of intervention has changed the life of a child, in different ways, but the question is how. And so I think my reflection would be to be very specific in what you want to measure, and then be very evidence-based. So everything that you want to measure, you do, for instance, do a systematic review, look at what the tools are out there, look what research has been out there, and build from what has been done before, rather than start from scratch and build a generic tool that to try and assess, when we know the findings that you will get is at best, a proxy measure.
Okay, Lynn, thank you for that. That's great. Then I have another question here from Catherine Campbell. In Northern Ireland, I feel there's still a very strong link between social disadvantage and school readiness, and in turn, educational outcomes, which unfortunately still in some cases seem to follow the child throughout their education. Have there been any really impactful interventions, programs in any other countries? Anybody find anything that have worked that we could maybe Catherine, have you anybody that you wish to target that question towards? Catherine?
No, I haven't really thought of anyone in particular. I think it's just, I suppose it's the same old thing. It's, how do you close that gap? And has there been anything really successful? Because obviously I'm a nursery teacher and I see our children coming in at 3 and 4 and the gap already exists. And very often it can be seen as sort of based in the child's socioeconomic status, which is unfortunate. And you do wonder how can we get this gap closed so it's not following the children on up to year 7 to school, to their GCSEs or A levels. They're basically, they're kind of their life chances in a way, really. Sorry, very big question.
Anybody wish to answer Catherine's question?
Glenda, can I just say one thing?
Yes.
It's a perennial issue, isn't it? This idea of moving away from school readiness and the child to a school that's actually ready for the child. And certainly going back to the previous question about leadership, I think it's hugely important that we start to take this at a systemic level. So for example, one of the kind of initiatives that's happening in the Republic of Ireland at the moment is that the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment are redesigning the primary school curriculum with a view to creating continuity of curriculum across from early childhood settings into primary level. So the idea is that ASHTR, our early childhood curriculum framework, is based around play and play-based learning, and that we need to move away from then a sudden shift as soon as the child goes into junior infants into this subject-based approach. So instead, what they're looking at doing is continuing that curriculum framework approach into the early years of primary level, and only bit by bit as it progresses up through the system do children start to engage on a more subject-based level. So obviously we don't know where that will go, or whether the planned ideas will come to fruition, but I think it's a good start.
Yes, and I would totally agree with that, Leah. Those transitions, getting those transitions right are so important, because you can do wonderful work in the preschool years. But then if we expect children to then go into a primary school experience, which is very formal and focused on whatever, we can undo all of the wonderful that work that has been done in those preschool years in that sense. So thank you for that, Leah. I see Oliver. Oliver, you have your hand up. Have you a wee question?
Yeah. I'm sort of interested in early intervention. We have our kids start school at age 4, and people keep saying it's one of the earliest school starting ages, which is fair enough. Maybe as they're starting school, but in a lot of other jurisdictions, they're in preschool settings or in some type of early education care setting anyway. But we then have our preschool program where children are in school or in the preschool from age 3 to 4, and then we have the Sure Start. And I'm trying to think about this issue about, you keep on saying early intervention in terms of group interventions. It's not about health intervention. I'm talking about from education's point of view. We have childcare settings, and childcare settings seem to support working parents, so they're not the disadvantaged kids. So I'm just wondering what more the Department of Education should be doing in terms of early intervention in a group way rather than individual way, if I'm getting that right. I know it's long-winded, that. So, I mean, one of the examples we're already looking at is our preschool offers 12.5 hours and 22.5 hours for kids. So it's not an equitable offer. So we're looking at standardizing that, maybe at 22.5 hours. We're also coming under pressure to go with the English, Scottish and Welsh model of 30 hours, but their model targets working parents. So it wouldn't be the disadvantaged ones. So I do struggle with this concept, early intervention, but it seems the focus does seem to be on working parents, which isn't really the disadvantaged kids who we should be supporting. I know that's not a precise question, so.
Well, sometimes we do find that some working parents are on the breadline in that particular sense as well, and do find a sort of paying for childcare, etc., challenging in that respect as well. And my answer from a Northern Ireland perspective would be an all-inclusive programme in that respect. But I will turn to Barbara as our a Northern Ireland speaker. Have you anything else to add there, Barbara?
I suppose, Oliver, it's back to that kind of still that inequality as well. We still have that split system. We still, there's still full-time, part-time, there's still statutory, voluntary, there's still differences in, yes, they all use the preschool curriculum and are inspected the same, but they'll have different ratios. I know that's one of the issues that's still an ongoing debate. The qualification of the leader, the graduate within the setting, for setting-based provision, which is what you're, asking about here, the equitableness of it, and as you say, maybe raising the hours up and trying to, I know people are working on it, but for that kind of setting-based provision within the preschool year, I think that needs to be ensured that it's equitable. I was interested, and I think it was Laura said about the piece of research about numbers dropping post-COVID, and maybe about that mask, and maybe you'll know better than me, Oliver. I was kind of looking at numbers, and it looked like the uptake on preschool has dropped recently. They were down to 90% uptake, and I don't know whether that's right or not, where I picked that up from, but I think definitely COVID has had a big impact as well, for many for many levels, at many different levels, and we will have a group of children, as you said, who have kind of been through this trauma, that are hitting the preschool or going into the statutory sector, and they're not coming through with the same experiences in the last 2 years as our previous children. And I think we really need to be doing something and speaking to the sector about ensuring that these children that we are really meeting their emotional needs and making sure that they're ready, as you say, that they're ready for school, or that school is ready for them. So I suppose that's my question, my bit, and from Stranmillis coming back, it's still about ensuring that we have that graduate led workforce that makes the difference across the sector.
Yeah, very much so, Barbara. I would very much agree with that, and that joined up approach, where we're not just thinking of 0 to 3s as separate to 3 to 4s and then 4 to 6s and whatever it might be. But okay, thank you for that. This leads on into Charlotte's question. Do you think the change to school starting age in Northern Ireland, that's the more flexible school starting age, could be potentially detrimental to disadvantaged children in terms of play opportunities, social interactions, and general safety nets? Ian, Barbara, maybe back to you for that one. And then we will round things up. I'll have a wee nosy to see if there's, over to you, Barbara.
I'm not, I suppose it's kind of the flexibility at the school starting age, and then you're saying, but where are they going to be? And maybe that's back to Oliver's question again. It's not about saying, right, you're not starting school. It's about maybe giving them access to, quality preschool for a longer period of time, so that they are emotionally ready to embrace the transition into the primary school. So I'm hopeful that flexibility there, that allows conversations to be had between the leader in the setting, who knows the child and knows the family and knows the context, that the flexibility is there to say, actually, I think it would be better for little Johnny to be with me for another year. I could see that would be better for him. So I'm hopeful that flexibility is a positive thing, as long as the child is in the right quality provision to support their needs.
Yes, and again, I would reiterate that in the sense that it's certainly a step in the right direction in that respect, but I also am slightly concerned about the foundation stage in that sense. So because we have the youngest children now catered for elsewhere, or having the option to be catered for elsewhere, I still would have a slight concern. Does that mean that we go back to formal literacy and numeracy in our foundation stage classes? And we certainly want to guard against that, that it's a building on process, and that our foundation stage classes are there to meet the needs and interests of each and every child that come their way in that sense. One final message, one final question. Anybody a final question to finish up on, or a final comment? I haven't missed anybody. That's what I'm checking through the chat here and checking through the speakers that nobody has their hand up. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of our research event this afternoon, our early years research event this afternoon. I know, personally speaking, I have thoroughly enjoyed it and found the presentations absolutely fascinating and learned greatly from each and every one. All that remains for me to say at this point is to thank again Professor Lynn for a wonderful keynote address, and each and every of our panel speakers. Dr. Helen Lewis, Dr. Lara Bronson, Dr. Leah O'Toole, Dr. Barbara McConnell, and Dr. Liz Chesworth. And last but not least, I would like to thank you as the audience for joining with us this afternoon. I hope you also enjoyed all of the presentations like I did and learned greatly from them. And we hope to see you all soon again. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and evening. Bye-bye.